The final chord of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata hung in the air of the small apartment, a melancholy echo that seemed to mirror Isabella Rossi's life. At 22, her world had shrunk to the space between her piano and her father's sickbed. The glitter of the Las Vegas Strip was a distant, mocking galaxy visible through the window, a world away from their quiet struggle. The knock on the door was not gentle. It was 3 sharp, authoritative raps that shook the flimsy wood in its frame. Isabella's hand stilled on the keys. No one visited at this hour. She opened the door to a silhouette that blocked the hallway light. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in a suit that cost more than everything she owned. His presence was a physical weight, pressing the air from the room. Behind him stood 2 other men, silent and watchful. "Isabella Rossi," he said. His voice was low, a gravelly rumble that held no warmth. "I am Lorenzo Moretti. We need to discuss your father's death." Her blood ran cold. Everyone knew that name. Moretti. The Wolf of Las Vegas. She stepped back, allowing him to enter, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He moved with a predator's grace, his dark eyes scanning the modest room, the worn furniture, the open door to her father's bedroom where the old man slept fitfully. "My father is unwell," she whispered, clutching the back of a chair for support. "Whatever he owes, I will find a way." Lorenzo turned his gaze on her, and she felt pinned by its intensity. "The debt is $80,000. The VIG has long since buried him. There is no finding a way, for a sum like this." Tears of desperation welled in her eyes. "What do you want then?" He studied her for a long silent moment, from her simple dress to the honest fear in her face. "There is an alternative. One that clears the debt entirely and ensures your father receives the finest medical care, a private facility where he can be properly looked after." A flicker of impossible hope sparked in her chest. "What alternative?" "You will marry me." The words were so absurd, so utterly terrifying that she almost laughed. "Marry you? I don't even know you." "This is not a proposal of courtship," he stated, his tone leaving no room for misunderstanding. "It is a business arrangement. My organization requires a certain image. A wife provides stability. In return, your father's obligations vanish. He gets his life. You ensure his comfort. It is a better offer than he deserves." Isabella stared at him, her mind reeling. She was a pawn, a piece to be moved on a chessboard she never agreed to play on. She thought of her father, his labored breathing, the constant fear of medical bills. She thought of a lifetime locked in a gilded cage. "I have a contract," Lorenzo said, pulling a single sheet of paper from his inside pocket. "Sign it and the debt is gone. Refuse and the consequences for your father will be severe." Her hand trembled as she took the pen. She did not read the document. What was the point? The choice was an illusion. With a final, silent goodbye to her old life, she signed her name at the bottom. Lorenzo took the paper, his fingers brushing against hers. A cold shiver ran up her arm. "Pack a bag," he said. "You are leaving with me now." Lorenzo's car was a silent, black phantom that glided through the neon heart of the city. Isabella sat as far from him as possible, watching the garish lights of the casinos blur into streaks of color. They arrived at a towering, exclusive hotel she had only ever seen from a distance. A private elevator whisked them directly to the penthouse. The doors opened not into a home, but into a masterpiece of modern opulence. The entire far wall was glass, presenting a breathtaking, panoramic view of the Strip. The interior was all cool marble, polished chrome, and minimalist furniture. It was stunning, sterile, and utterly soulless. "This is your residence now," Lorenzo said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "You may go anywhere within these walls. Leaving requires my explicit permission and an escort." An elderly woman with kind eyes and a severe bun of gray hair approached. "This is Clara," Lorenzo said. "She manages the household. She will see to your needs." Clara gave Isabella a small, sympathetic smile that did little to ease her terror. A large, unsmiling man with a coiled earpiece stood by the elevator. "And that is Marco, head of security. Your safety is his priority. Which means he is also your shadow." Lorenzo turned to leave. "I have business. Clara will show you to your room. Do not attempt anything foolish." Once he was gone, Clara's demeanor softened. "Come, child," she said gently. "Let me get you settled." She led Isabella to a room that was more a luxury suite than a bedroom, with its own lavish bathroom and a smaller version of the stunning city view. It was beautiful, but the lock was on the outside of the door. "He is not a gentle man," Clara said, placing a comforting hand on Isabella's arm. "But he is a man of his word. Your father has already been moved to Sunrise Hills Sanitarium. It is the best. The news was a small anchor in her whirling storm of fear. She had done the right thing. Her father was safe. Alone, Isabella walked to the window, pressing her palms against the cool glass. She was in a cage, a gilded one high above the world, owned by a wolf. The city glittered below, a sea of freedom she could no longer touch. For a week, Isabella saw Lorenzo only in fleeting moments. He would arrive late, leave early, and offer no more than a curt nod in her direction. The silence was a torment. Then one evening he presented her with a long black garment bag. We are attending the opening of the Celestial Diamond Casino. Be ready in 1 hour. Wear this. Inside was a gown of deep emerald silk, exquisitely cut and undoubtedly couture. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever touched, and putting it on felt like putting on a costume for a play she never auditioned for. When she emerged, Lorenzo was waiting. His eyes swept over her, and for a fraction of a second, something unreadable flickered in their dark depths. Presentable, he said, offering his arm. It was not a request. The opening was a whirlwind of light, sound, and suffocating pressure. Powerful men in expensive suits and women in glittering jewels surrounded Lorenzo, their laughter too loud, their eyes too sharp. They all looked at her, the mysterious new Mrs. Moretti, with open curiosity. Your wife is stunning, Lorenzo, a casino magnate boomed, his gaze lingering on Isabella a little too long. Lorenzo's arm tightened around her waist, a possessive, warning pressure. She is, he agreed, his voice cutting through the noise. He looked down at her, his expression a mask of cool affection. Isn't she, my dear? Isabella's heart hammered, but she forced a serene smile, leaning into his side as if it were the most natural place in the world. You are too kind, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her soul. She watched him, this man who was her husband. She saw the way men deferred to him, the subtle fear they tried to hide behind their smiles. She saw the cold calculation in his eyes as he conducted his business, all while keeping her anchored to his side. In that moment she understood her role completely. She was a prop, a beautiful accessory to reinforce his power. But as she smiled and nodded, playing her part perfectly, a new emotion began to burn through the fear. It was a small, defiant spark of resolve. If this was the part she had to play, she would learn the lines until she could recite them in her sleep. She would survive this. The performance at the casino left Isabella drained. The return to the penthouse was silent, the earlier facade of the doting wife crumbling away with the closing of the elevator doors. Lorenzo retreated into his study without a word, and the immense space felt colder than ever. Days bled into one another. Lorenzo's presence was a constant, unspoken pressure. He watched her during their silent meals, his dark eyes noting every movement as if she were a complex equation he could not solve. Her virginity, she realized, had become a symbol of this wall between them. It was a prize he was entitled to yet seemed to resent for the complication it represented. One night, the nightmare returned. It was the same one that had haunted her since childhood. The feeling of falling, of being utterly alone in a vast, dark space, the sound of her own cries swallowed by the emptiness. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding, the sheets tangled around her legs, a cold sweat on her skin. A soft sob escaped her before she could stifle it. She clamped a hand over her mouth, praying the thick walls would contain the sound. They did not. Minutes later, her bedroom door opened silently. Lorenzo stood there, silhouetted by the dim hallway light. He was not wearing his suit jacket, his white shirt undone at the collar. He looked more real, more human than she had ever seen him. Isabella? His voice was low, stripped of its usual command. She could not form words, only pulling the sheets tighter around herself, ashamed of her vulnerability. He did not turn on the light. He simply walked to the side of her bed and stood there, a tall, dark shadow in the quiet room. The city lights cast a soft glow across his features, and for a fleeting moment, the hard lines of his face seemed to soften. A dream? He asked. She managed a shaky nod. He was silent for a long time, just looking at her. The fear she usually felt in his presence was gone, replaced by a strange, heavy stillness. He reached out, his fingers hesitating for a heartbeat before they brushed a stray tear from her cheek. The touch was startlingly gentle. Go back to sleep, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Then, as if catching himself in an act of weakness, he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. The brief connection was severed, but the memory of his touch lingered on her skin, a confusing brand of something that was not cruelty. 2 nights later he came to her. There was no announcement, no preamble. He simply entered her room as she was brushing her hair before the window. The air grew instantly charged, thick with unspoken intent. The grace period was over. "Isabella," he said. His tone was different tonight, resolved, final. She set the brush down, her hands trembling. She had known this moment would come, had dreaded it, and yet the sight of him, so intensely focused on her, sent a flush of heat through her veins that was not entirely fear. He crossed the room until he stood directly before her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne. "You are my wife," he stated, his gaze holding hers captive. "In the eyes of the city, in the eyes of my world. But a marriage must be consummated to be real." He lifted a hand not to strike but to cradle her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, a possessive, deliberate gesture. She felt her breath catch. "I made a vow when I brought you here," he continued, his voice dropping to that low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. "You will take all of me tonight. Not just the husband but the man. The one who built an empire from nothing. The one who has done terrible things to protect it. All of it." It was not a request. It was a vow, a claiming. And in that moment, Isabella understood it was not merely about physical possession. It was a demand for her complete acceptance of the darkness and the light within him. Her fear did not vanish, but it was joined by a surge of defiant courage. She had made a choice to save her father. She would see it through. She would not cower. She lifted her chin, meeting his fierce gaze. "Then take me," she whispered. Her quiet acceptance seemed to be the key that unlocked a door inside him. His kiss was not gentle, but it was not cruel. It was consuming, a storm of pent-up passion and desperate need. And as he led her to the bed, Isabella did not close her eyes and endure. She kept them open, watching the man, her husband, and in a shocking, profound shift, she began to surrender not just her body, but a small, guarded piece of her soul. Sunlight streamed into the room, painting golden stripes across the rumpled sheets. Isabella awoke alone, but the space beside her still held the impression of his body and the faint scent of him on the pillow. The world felt different. The air in the penthouse was lighter. When she walked into the main living area, she found Lorenzo standing by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand. He turned as she entered. "Good morning," he said. His voice was calm, his usual icy demeanor replaced by a contemplative stillness. "Good morning," she replied, her own voice soft. He studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming something to himself. He did not touch her, but the look in his eyes was a caress. Before he left for his office, his hand brushed against her arm, a lingering, possessive touch that sent a shiver through her. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer just her captor. He was her husband. Fueled by this new, confusing connection, her curiosity grew from a spark into a flame. She began to truly explore her gilded cage. It was during this exploration that she noticed it, a door, sleek and white, tucked away in a hallway near his study. Unlike every other door, it was locked. Later, while Clara was arranging flowers in the main room, Isabella casually asked about it. Clara's hands stilled among the blooms. She looked up, her kind eyes shadowed with a sudden wariness. "That room is Mr. Moretti's private study. No one is permitted inside. Not even the staff to clean." She met Isabella's gaze directly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Some doors, child, are better left unopened. For your own peace." The warning was clear, but it only made the mystery more compelling. As she passed the door again, her eyes caught a small, framed photograph on a nearby console table she had never noticed before. It was an old, faded picture of a young woman with dark, flowing hair and a bright, laughing smile. A smile that felt hauntingly familiar. Isabella stared at the photograph, her heart beginning to pound with a new, dawning understanding. The woman looked like her. Lorenzo informed her they would be attending a charity gala for the city's children's hospital. "The Cavallo family will be there," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Do not speak to any of them. Especially not the father, Alessio." The Cavallo name sent a chill through her. She remembered Lorenzo's warning. They were the rivals. The gala was a sea of diamonds and insincere smiles. Isabella wore a gown of midnight blue, her hand resting on Lorenzo's arm as they navigated the crowd. She played her part perfectly, a serene smile fixed on her face. Then, as Lorenzo was drawn into a conversation with the mayor, a man materialized at her side. He was older, with silver-streaked hair and a smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Mrs. Moretti," he said, his voice a smooth, oily sound. "Alessio Cavallo." I must say you are even more captivating up close. Lorenzo has always had an eye for beauty. Isabella's smile tightened. Mr. Cavallo. Please call me Alesso. He leaned in slightly, his gaze intrusive. I knew your father, you know. A good man if tragically weak. It is a terrible burden, a daughter's love, used as a bargaining chip. Her blood ran cold. I do not know what you mean. Of course you do, he murmured, his voice for her alone. We all make sacrifices for family. My own son Marco was lost too young. A terrible accident. His eyes hardened. Lorenzo's world is one of violence and taking. I wonder, do you feel safe in that penthouse? Do you sleep soundly knowing what he is capable of? He sees things not as people but as possessions. Tell me, does he ever call you Sophia in his more tender moments? The name struck her like a physical blow. Sophia. The woman in the photograph. Before she could form a response, a hand clamped down on Alesso Cavallo's shoulder. Lorenzo stood there, his expression a mask of terrifying calm. Alesso, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You are disturbing my wife. The air crackled with tension. Cavallo's smile returned, brittle now. Just welcoming her to our city, Lorenzo. She is a lovely addition. With a nod to Isabella, he melted back into the crowd. Lorenzo's grip on her arm was firm as he guided her away. What did he say to you? He demanded, his voice low and fierce. He mentioned my father, Isabella whispered, shaken. And a name. Sophia. Lorenzo's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering. He said nothing more, but the protective, furious energy radiating from him was a tangible force for the rest of the evening. The encounter with Cavallo consumed her. The name Sophia echoed in her mind, intertwining with the image of the laughing girl in the photograph. Clara's warning was forgotten, overridden by a desperate need to understand the ghost that stood between her and her husband. The next afternoon, hearing Lorenzo leave for a meeting, she acted. She found a small, decorative hairpin in her room. With a pounding heart, she slipped it into the lock of the white door, her hands trembling. It was a foolish, reckless act, but the need for truth was greater than her fear. After a moment of fumbling, there was a soft click. The door swung open. The room was dim, the air still and heavy with the scent of old paper and dried flowers. It was not a study. It was a shrine. One wall was covered in photographs of the girl from the console table, Sophia, at various ages. A glass case held a collection of ballet slippers and sheet music. On a small velvet-covered table lay a single, framed graduation portrait. And beside it, a faded newspaper article with a headline that screamed, Moretti heiress Sophia perishes in tragic fire, arson suspected. Isabella's hand flew to her mouth. Lorenzo's sister. Not a lover. A sister tragically lost. The resemblance was not a coincidence. It was a thread of cruel fate. You were told not to come in here. Lorenzo's voice from the doorway was hollow, stripped of all its power, filled only with a profound and ancient pain. She whirled around, expecting fury, ready for his wrath. But he was not angry. He stood slumped against the doorframe, his face ashen, looking older and more broken than she could have imagined. The formidable wolf was gone, leaving only a grieving brother. I am so sorry, Lorenzo, she whispered, tears in her eyes. He walked past her and picked up the graduation photo, his thumb gently tracing his sister's face. It was Cavallo, he said, the words torn from him. He targeted her to get to my father. The fire was a message. I was supposed to be with her that night. I was late. He finally looked at Isabella, his eyes blazing with a grief so raw it stole her breath. I vowed that day that I would destroy him. And I vowed I would never let myself lose someone like that again. Then I saw you, and you looked so much like her. I thought if I could keep you safe, locked away in a tower, it would be a penance. A way to atone. Isabella did not retreat from his pain. She stepped forward and placed her hand over his on the photograph. It was not a gesture of pity, but of shared understanding. You are not to blame, Lorenzo. The only one who bears that guilt is Alesso Cavallo. In that quiet, sacred space, the last of the walls between them crumbled to dust. He was no longer her captor and she was no longer his captive. They were two souls scarred by the cruelty of others, bound by a shared enemy and a newfound, fragile trust. That night they spoke for hours. He told her stories of Sophia, of the boy he had been before the tragedy. She in turn shared her own fears, her quiet life, the weight of her father's weakness. The penthouse was no longer a cage, it had become a sanctuary. The next morning, as Lorenzo reviewed security reports, a thought occurred to Isabella. Lorenzo, she began, her voice tentative but clear. At the gala, Cavallo mentioned his son Marco. He said it was an accident, but the way he said it, it was full of hatred for you. Lorenzo looked up, his business focus sharpening. It was a car accident. A genuine one. But he has always believed I arranged it. Is it possible, Isabella asked, thinking of the man's cold, manipulative eyes, that he is using his son's memory? That he is planning something he knows will provoke you, hoping you will act recklessly out of anger? Lorenzo was silent for a long moment, considering her words. A look of dawning respect crossed his face. You see the board differently than I do, he said. I look for the direct attack. You see the move behind the move. He reached out and took her hand, pulling her to him. His kiss was not one of consuming passion, but of deep, profound gratitude and partnership. You are not just my wife, Isabella, he vowed, his forehead resting against hers. You are my ally. The peace of their newfound alliance was shattered days later. Isabella was studying a sheet of music at the piano when Marco, his face a grim mask, received a call. His expression tightened. Sir, he said into the phone, there is a situation. A car just forced Mrs. Moretti's vehicle off the road near the boutique. She is gone. Lorenzo's roar of fury was a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. The man Isabella had seen in the shrine was gone, replaced by the wolf, a predator whose mate had been threatened. Isabella, however, felt a strange calm settle over her. This was Cavallo's move. This was the provocation. She was not a victim, she was a piece on the board, and she refused to be played. As Lorenzo began barking orders, mobilizing his entire organization, she walked to the piano and quietly slipped her small, silver pen into the pocket of her dress. She was taken to a windowless room in the back of a rundown warehouse. Two men guarded her, their conversation making it clear they were waiting for Lorenzo to arrive, walking blindly into a trap. They had taken her phone, but they had not searched her. Could one of you please tell me what time it is? Isabella asked, her voice feigning a tremor. My husband will be so worried. One of the men grunted, glancing at his watch. He will know soon enough. It was the distraction she needed. As he looked away, she uncapped the pen and began to write on the dusty concrete floor large, clear letters. Back entrance. Trap. When the sound of squealing tires and shouting erupted outside, her guards drew their weapons and ran toward the main warehouse door, just as she had hoped they would. Lorenzo's assault was a symphony of controlled violence. But as he fought his way through Cavallo's men, his only thought was Isabella, his focus narrowed to a laser point. This was the recklessness Cavallo had counted on. He burst into the room where they said she was being held, expecting to find her cowering. Instead, he found the room empty. For a heart-stopping second, he thought he was too late. Then his eyes fell on the message scrawled on the floor. His head snapped up, understanding flashing in his eyes. He changed his course, signaling his men to flank the building. The diversion worked perfectly. While Cavallo's forces were concentrated on the main entrance, Lorenzo's team stormed the back, catching them completely by surprise. The fight was short and decisive. Lorenzo found Alesso Cavallo trying to flee through a side door. There is no escape, Alesso, Lorenzo said, his voice cold as steel. Not this time. For Sofia. The final confrontation was not a long battle, but a final settling of accounts. With the authorities who were conveniently late on their way, Lorenzo ensured Cavallo's empire would crumble into dust. He found Isabella being helped out of the warehouse by Marco. She was pale but unharmed, her chin held high. When she saw Lorenzo, she ran to him and he caught her in a crushing embrace, his face buried in her hair. I thought I lost you, he breathed, his voice raw with emotion. You told me I had to take all of you, she whispered against his chest. That means I must be strong enough to stand beside you, not just behind you. He cupped her face, his eyes, once so cold, now filled with a reverence that made her heart soar. I vowed you would take all of me. But you, Isabella, you have given me a reason to be a man worth taking. Weeks later, they stood together on the balcony of their penthouse, the city lights twinkling below like a kingdom they had reclaimed together. His arm was around her, holding her close. She was no longer his captive wife or a mere symbol. She was his partner, his equal, his love. The future was no longer a gilded cage, but a horizon they would face as one, stronger together than they ever were apart. If you were captivated by Isabella's strength and Lorenzo's redemption, please like and subscribe for more stories of love, power, and unforgettable romance.